The steam whistle echoed across the Pennsylvania countryside as Thomas McKenna wiped the sweat from his brow. Another long day laying track for the Pennsylvania Railroad had come to an end, and the setting sun painted the steel rails gold in the distance. At 28, Thomas had spent the better part of a decade working these lines, moving from town to town as the railroad expanded westward through the growing nation. Unlike most of his fellow workers who gathered at the local tavern each evening, Thomas preferred solitude. He walked slowly back toward the boarding house where he rented a small room, his calloused hands still aching from swinging the heavy sledgehammer all day. The work was back-breaking, but it paid well enough for a man with simple needs. Thomas had been saving every penny he could spare, dreaming of the day he might own a small plot of land and settle down somewhere permanent. The town of Millbrook had grown considerably since the railroad arrived 2 years ago. What once was a sleepy farming community now bustled with commerce and new residents drawn by the promise of prosperity. Among the most successful of these newcomers was Henry Whitmore, a shrewd merchant who had established a general store that served both the railroad workers and the local farming families. Thomas first noticed Henry's daughter, Margaret, on a crisp autumn morning 6 months ago. She had been standing outside her father's store, directing the unloading of goods from a supply wagon. Her auburn hair caught the morning light, and when she smiled at one of the workers, Thomas felt something stir in his chest that he had never experienced before. Margaret Whitmore was everything Thomas was not. Where he was rough and weathered from years of hard labor, she carried herself with the refined grace of a young woman raised in comfort. Her dresses were always perfectly pressed, her manners impeccable, and her education evident in every conversation. At 22, she was considered the most eligible young woman in Millbrook, and Thomas knew he was far from the only man who had noticed her charm. For months, Thomas had found excuses to visit Whitmore's general store. He would purchase unnecessary items just to hear Margaret's voice as she tallied his purchases, or to catch a glimpse of her smile. Gradually, their brief exchanges grew longer. Margaret seemed genuinely interested when Thomas spoke about his work on the railroad, asking thoughtful questions about the routes and the challenges of laying track across difficult terrain. Henry Whitmore, however, had made his feelings about Thomas quite clear. The merchant viewed the railroad worker as nothing more than transient labor, unsuitable for his accomplished daughter. Whitmore had grander plans for Margaret's future, hoping to arrange a marriage with the son of another successful merchant family from Philadelphia. Despite her father's disapproval, Margaret began to show Thomas small kindnesses. She would save the freshest bread for his visits, or remember his preference for certain items. Their conversations, though brief and always within earshot of others, revealed a growing mutual respect and affection. The turning point came on a snowy December evening. Thomas had been walking past the store when he noticed Margaret struggling to close the heavy wooden shutters against the wind. Without hesitation, he stepped forward to help, securing each shutter while she held his lantern. In the golden glow of the lamplight, with snowflakes dancing around them, Margaret looked up at Thomas with an expression that made his heart race. "Thank you, Thomas," she had said softly. "You are always so kind." "It is nothing, Miss Margaret," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I would do anything to help you." Their eyes met for a long moment, and Thomas saw something in her gaze that gave him hope. From that evening forward, he began to seriously consider the possibility that Margaret might return his feelings. The decision to ask for her hand in marriage did not come easily. Thomas spent weeks agonizing over the proposal, knowing full well that Henry Whitmore would never approve. He had saved nearly $300 over the years, enough to purchase a modest home and provide for a wife, at least initially. More importantly, the railroad had offered him a position as a foreman, which would mean better pay and the stability of staying in one location. On a warm spring morning in May, Thomas finally gathered the courage to approach Henry Whitmore. The merchant listened with barely concealed disdain as Thomas explained his intentions and his financial situation. Whitmore's response was swift and cutting. "Mr. McKenna, my daughter is destined for far greater things than life with a railroad laborer. I suggest you focus your attentions elsewhere." Undeterred, Thomas decided to speak directly with Margaret. He waited until she was alone in the store one afternoon and nervously approached the counter where she was organizing inventory. "Miss Margaret," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I have something important to ask you." Margaret looked up from her work, her green eyes curious and attentive. Thomas took a deep breath and spoke from his heart, telling her of his love, his plans for their future, and his promise to work tirelessly to provide her with a good life. To his amazement and joy, Margaret accepted his proposal. Her eyes filled with tears as she explained that she had grown to love him as well. Despite knowing her father would never approve, they agreed to marry quickly before Henry could interfere or arrange another match for his daughter. The wedding was planned for the following Saturday at the small church on the edge of town. Thomas spent his life savings on a simple gold ring and a new suit for the occasion. Margaret would wear her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved since her death 5 years earlier. As the wedding day approached, Thomas felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He knew that marrying Margaret would change everything about his carefully ordered life, but he could not imagine a future without her by his side. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers across Millbrook. Thomas woke before sunrise in his cramped boarding house room, too nervous and excited to sleep any longer. He had spent the previous evening polishing his new black boots until they gleamed and carefully pressing his wedding suit with the help of Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house keeper, who had taken a motherly interest in his upcoming marriage. The small wooden church sat on a hill overlooking the town, its white painted walls and simple bell tower a beacon of hope for Thomas as he walked the dusty road leading up to it. Reverend Morrison had agreed to perform the ceremony despite Henry Whitmore's vocal objections. The elderly minister had known Margaret since she was a child and believed that love should triumph over social expectations. Thomas arrived at the church 2 hours early, unable to contain his anticipation. He paced nervously in the small vestry, adjusting his tie repeatedly and checking his pocket watch every few minutes. The simple gold wedding ring felt heavy in his vest pocket, a tangible symbol of the commitment he was about to make. As the morning progressed, a handful of guests began to arrive. Most were Thomas's fellow railroad workers, rough men who had cleaned up as best they could for the occasion. They wore their Sunday clothes and had slicked back their hair with pomade, showing respect for their friend's important day. Among them was Patrick O'Sullivan, an Irishman who had worked alongside Thomas for 3 years and served as his witness. Margaret had invited her closest friend, Sarah Chen, whose family had emigrated from China and opened a laundry business in town. Sarah was one of the few people who had supported Margaret's decision to marry Thomas, understanding what it meant to face social prejudice. She arrived early to help Margaret prepare, carrying a small bouquet of white roses that she had carefully cultivated in her family's garden. Notably absent were members of Margaret's extended family and the prominent families of Millbrook. Henry Whitmore had made it clear that anyone attending the wedding would no longer be welcome in his store or his social circle. This threat had effectively isolated Margaret from the community she had known all her life. At 11 o'clock, Thomas took his place at the altar alongside Reverend Morrison. The church was sparsely filled, with perhaps 20 people scattered among the wooden pews. Sunlight streamed through the simple glass windows, casting colourful patterns across the floor. Thomas felt his heart racing as he watched the church door, waiting for his bride to appear. Margaret had spent the morning at Sarah's house, away from her father's angry presence. She carefully put on her mother's ivory silk wedding dress, which Sarah had helped alter to fit her smaller frame. The dress was simple but elegant, with delicate lace sleeves and a high neckline that reflected the modest fashion of the era. Margaret's hands trembled as she fastened her mother's pearl necklace, the only jewellery she owned besides the simple gold ring Thomas would soon place on her finger. As Margaret prepared to leave for the church, Henry Whitmore appeared at Sarah's door. His face was red with anger, and his usually neat appearance was dishevelled. He had spent the morning drinking whiskey and working himself into a rage over his daughter's defiance. "Margaret Elizabeth Whitmore," he shouted, pushing past Sarah into the small parlour. "I forbid you to go through with this madness. That man will ruin your life, and you will drag our family name through the mud." Margaret faced her father with a composure that surprised even herself. She had expected this confrontation and had prepared her response carefully. "Father, I'm 22 years old and I've made my choice. Thomas is a good man who loves me, and I love him in return. That is more than many women can say about their marriages." Henry's face grew even redder as he realized his daughter would not be swayed. "If you walk out that door and marry that railroad worker, you are no longer my daughter. You will receive nothing from me, not 1 penny of inheritance, and you will never be welcome in my home again." The words hit Margaret like physical blows, but she maintained her dignified stance. She had known this moment would come, had prepared herself for the possibility of losing her family forever. "Then I suppose this is goodbye, Father. I pray that someday you will understand that love cannot be bought or arranged like a business transaction." With Sarah by her side, Margaret walked out of the house and toward the church, leaving her father standing alone in the parlour. Each step away from her childhood home felt like both a loss and a liberation. The walk to the church gave Margaret time to compose herself and reflect on the magnitude of her decision. She was about to marry a man who could offer her little in terms of material comfort compared to what she was leaving behind, but Thomas had shown her a kind of genuine affection and respect that she had never experienced with the wealthy suitors her father had paraded before her. As the church bell began to toll noon, Margaret and Sarah reached the bottom of the hill. Margaret could see Thomas's figure standing at the altar through the open church doors, and her heart filled with a mixture of love and determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them as Thomas's wife. The small group of wedding guests rose to their feet as Margaret entered the church. She walked slowly down the aisle, her eyes fixed on Thomas's face. She could see the joy and relief in his expression as she approached, and any remaining doubts about her decision melted away. As Margaret reached the altar, Thomas extended his hand to help her up the single wooden step. The warmth of his calloused palm against her gloved fingers should have been reassuring, but instead, Margaret felt a sudden chill run through her body. Standing there before Reverend Morrison, surrounded by the expectant faces of the small congregation, the reality of what she was about to do crashed over her like a cold wave. Reverend Morrison opened his worn leather Bible and began the traditional ceremony. His voice echoed in the small church as he spoke about the sacred bonds of matrimony, the commitment between a man and woman to love and honor each other through all of life's trials. Thomas stood straight and proud beside Margaret, his eyes never leaving her face, completely unaware of the turmoil building within his bride. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Marriage is an honorable estate, instituted by God, and is not to be entered into lightly or unadvisedly." Margaret's breathing became shallow as she listened to the familiar words. She had attended many weddings in this same church, had imagined her own ceremony countless times as a young girl. But now, faced with the actual moment, she felt overwhelmed by doubt and fear. The weight of her father's ultimatum pressed heavily on her mind, along with the realization that she was about to cut herself off from everything familiar and secure. The Reverend continued with the traditional questions. "Thomas McKenna, do you take Margaret Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Thomas's voice was strong and clear as he responded, "I do." His face radiated happiness and confidence, and Margaret could see the deep love in his eyes. This made what she was about to do even more painful. "Margaret Whitmore," Reverend Morrison turned to her, "do you take Thomas McKenna to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" The church fell silent. Every person present leaned forward slightly, waiting for her response. Thomas's smile was encouraging, his hand gently squeezing hers, but Margaret found herself unable to speak. The words seemed stuck in her throat, and her vision began to blur with unshed tears. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Sarah shifted nervously in her seat, sensing something was wrong. Patrick O'Sullivan frowned, wondering why the bride was taking so long to respond to such a simple question. Thomas's expression began to change from joy to concern as he noticed Margaret's pale complexion and trembling hands. "Margaret," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Are you all right?" Margaret looked up at him, seeing the worry and confusion in his eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but instead of the expected, "I do," different words tumbled out. "I cannot," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am sorry, Thomas, but I cannot do this." A collective gasp arose from the small congregation. Thomas stared at her in disbelief, his face draining of colour. "What do you mean you cannot?" "Margaret, we discussed this. You agreed to marry me. You said you loved me." Margaret stepped back, pulling her hands free from his grasp. Tears began flowing down her cheeks, but her voice grew stronger. I do love you, Thomas. That is not the question, but I realize now that love alone is not enough. I cannot give up everything I have known, everything I am, to become the wife of a railroad worker. The brutally honest words hung in the air like a physical presence. Thomas felt as though he had been struck by a sledgehammer. All around them, wedding guests whispered among themselves, some expressing sympathy for the jilted groom, others nodding in understanding of Margaret's decision. But you knew what I was from the beginning, Thomas said, his voice cracking with emotion. You knew I worked for the railroad. You knew I was not wealthy. What has changed? Margaret wiped her tears with her lace handkerchief, struggling to maintain her composure. What has changed is that I finally understand what it truly means. When I accepted your proposal, I was thinking with my heart, not my head. But standing here now, I realize I cannot abandon my family, my position in society, my entire way of life for an uncertain future. Reverend Morrison cleared his throat awkwardly. In his 40 years of performing wedding ceremonies, he had never encountered such a situation. Perhaps we should adjourn for a few minutes to allow the couple to discuss this privately, he suggested. No, Margaret said firmly. There is nothing to discuss. I have made my decision. She turned to face Thomas directly, her green eyes bright with tears but resolute. Thomas, you deserve a wife who can commit to you completely, without reservation or regret. I am not that woman. I thought I could be, but I was wrong. Thomas felt his world collapsing around him. The woman he loved, the woman he had planned to spend his life with, was rejecting him in front of everyone he knew. The humiliation was almost as painful as the heartbreak. So this is about money after all, he said bitterly. About social standing and what people will think. I thought you were different, Margaret. I thought you saw past all of that. It is not about money, Margaret replied, though her voice lacked conviction. It is about reality, about being honest with ourselves about what kind of life we could have together. I have been sheltered and privileged my entire life. I do not know how to be the wife of a working man, and I'm not sure I can learn. Sarah stood up from her pew, clearly torn between supporting her friend and feeling sorry for Thomas. The railroad workers looked uncomfortable and angry, feeling that their friend had been publicly humiliated by someone who thought herself too good for him. Thomas removed the gold wedding ring from his pocket and stared at it for a long moment. Then he placed it on the altar and stepped away from Margaret. I understand, he said quietly. You have made your choice. I wish you well, Miss Whitmore. The formality of using her maiden name again struck Margaret like a physical blow, but she knew she deserved it. She watched as Thomas walked down the aisle and out of the church, his shoulders straight despite his obvious pain. The church emptied quickly after Thomas's departure, leaving Margaret standing alone at the altar with Reverend Morrison and Sarah. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of Thomas's footsteps echoing down the hill. Margaret remained motionless, staring at the simple gold ring he had left behind on the wooden altar, its surface catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Margaret, dear, Sarah said gently, approaching her friend with careful steps. Perhaps we should go back to my house. You need time to rest and think about what has happened. Margaret nodded numbly, allowing Sarah to guide her out of the church. As they walked down the hill toward town, Margaret could see small groups of people gathered on street corners, their heads bent together in animated conversation. Word of the failed wedding was already spreading through Millbrook like wildfire. She knew that by evening, everyone in town would know that Margaret Whitmore had refused to marry the railroad worker at the altar. The walk to Sarah's house felt endless. Margaret was acutely aware of the curious stares and whispered comments from townspeople they passed. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with judgment, and a few with barely concealed satisfaction at seeing the merchant's proud daughter brought low. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, maintaining what little dignity she could muster. Meanwhile, Thomas had returned to his boarding house room, where he sat on the edge of his narrow bed in his wedding suit, staring at the floor. The events of the past hour felt like a nightmare from which he could not wake. The woman he loved, the woman who had accepted his proposal and planned their future together, had publicly declared him unworthy of her commitment. Patrick O'Sullivan knocked on Thomas's door, entering without waiting for permission. The Irishman's weathered face was flushed with anger on behalf of his friend. Thomas, lad, I am so sorry. That woman had no right to humiliate you like that in front of everyone. Thomas looked up at his friend with hollow eyes. She had every right, Patrick. She was honest about her feelings, perhaps more honest than I was willing to be with myself. Honest? Patrick scoffed. She led you on for months, accepted your proposal, planned a wedding, and then left you standing at the altar. There is nothing honest about that kind of behavior. Thomas stood and began removing his wedding suit, hanging each piece carefully in his small wardrobe. She realized she was making a mistake before it was too late to correct it. I should be grateful for that, I suppose. Better to know now than after we were married. Patrick watched his friend's mechanical movements with growing concern. What will you do now? Thomas sat back down on his bed, now dressed in his everyday work clothes. I will do what I have always done. I will work. The railroad does not care about my personal problems, and there is track to be laid. That evening, Margaret sat in Sarah's small parlour, having finally removed her mother's wedding dress and changed into a simple day dress. She had not spoken since returning from the church, and Sarah was beginning to worry about her friend's emotional state. Margaret, you need to eat something, Sarah urged, bringing a tray of tea and biscuits. You have had nothing all day, Margaret shook her head. I am not hungry. I keep thinking about the look on Thomas's face when I refused the vows. He looked so hurt, so betrayed, and he has every right to feel that way. Sarah sat beside her friend on the small sofa. You did what you felt you had to do. No one can fault you for being honest about your feelings. But that is just it, Margaret said, finally meeting Sarah's eyes. I was not being honest. The truth is that I do love Thomas. I love his kindness, his integrity, his strength. But I was terrified of what loving him would cost me. What do you mean? Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street. I was raised to expect a certain kind of life. Comfort, security, social position. Thomas could offer me love and devotion, but he could not offer me the life I have always known. When I stood at that altar, all I could think about were the sacrifices I would have to make. Sarah joined her at the window. And now? Do you regret your decision? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I regret the way I handled it. Thomas deserved better than to be humiliated in public. But as for the decision itself, she paused, struggling with her conflicted emotions. I honestly do not know. Across town, Henry Whitmore was having his own complicated reaction to the day's events. When word reached him that Margaret had refused to go through with the wedding, he felt a mixture of relief and concern. Relief that his daughter had come to her senses before making what he considered a terrible mistake, but concern about the manner in which she had done it. Henry had built his success in business, partly on his reputation for integrity and keeping his word. The idea that his daughter had publicly broken a promise, regardless of his approval of the match, troubled him deeply. He also knew that the scandal would affect his business relationships and social standing in the community. As evening approached, Henry made a decision that surprised even himself. He walked to Sarah Chen's house and knocked on the door. When Sarah answered, her expression was wary. Mr. Whitmore. Margaret is resting. I do not think she is ready to see anyone right now. I need to speak with my daughter, Henry said firmly. What happened today affects our entire family. Sarah reluctantly allowed him inside, and Margaret appeared in the parlour doorway, her face pale but composed. Father and daughter regarded each other for a long moment, the tension between them palpable. Margaret, Henry began, his voice softer than usual. I heard what happened at the church today. Are you here to tell me you were right all along? Margaret asked, a bitter edge to her voice. Henry was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. I am here because, regardless of my feelings about your choice of husband, I am concerned about how you handled the situation. The Whitmore name means something in this community, and today's events will have consequences for both of us. Margaret felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over her. In her focus on her own internal struggle, she had not fully considered how her actions would affect her father's business and reputation. I am sorry, Father. I never meant to bring shame on our family name. The damage is done now, Henry replied. The question is what we do next. 3 weeks had passed since the failed wedding, and the consequences of that day were becoming increasingly apparent throughout Millbrook. Margaret had returned to her father's house, but the atmosphere remained tense and uncomfortable. Henry had agreed to take her back, but their relationship was strained by unspoken resentment and disappointment on both sides. The social isolation Margaret experienced was more severe than she had anticipated. Many of the town's prominent families, who had previously welcomed her into their social circles, now treated her with cool politeness at best. The ladies' auxiliary meetings she had once enjoyed attending became exercises in enduring whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Margaret found herself increasingly confined to her father's store and their home, cut off from the community life she had once taken for granted. Henry's business had indeed suffered from the scandal. Several long-time customers had taken their trade elsewhere, either out of disapproval of Margaret's behavior or simply to avoid the awkwardness of the situation. The merchant had been forced to lower prices on certain goods to retain customers, eating into his profit margins. More troubling was the cancellation of a lucrative contract to supply goods to a new hotel being built in the neighboring town. The investors had expressed concerns about doing business with someone whose family reliability was questionable. At the general store, Margaret threw herself into work with an intensity that surprised her father. She reorganized inventory, updated the bookkeeping system, and even suggested new products that might appeal to the growing railroad worker population. But despite her efforts to prove her value, the tension between father and daughter remained palpable. "Margaret, you cannot hide in this store forever," Henry said one afternoon as they closed up shop. "People will eventually move on to other topics of conversation, but you need to begin rebuilding your reputation in this community." Margaret looked up from the ledger she had been reviewing. "And how exactly do you suggest I do that, father? Half the town thinks I am a heartless woman who humiliated a good man, and the other half thinks I am a foolish girl who does not know her own mind. Neither assessment is entirely wrong." Henry studied his daughter's face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way she had lost weight over the past few weeks. "Perhaps it is time you considered other options. I have been corresponding with your cousin Elizabeth in Philadelphia. She and her husband have offered to host you for an extended visit. A change of scenery might be beneficial." The suggestion struck Margaret like a physical blow. "You want to send me away? After everything that has happened, you want to exile me from the only home I have ever known?" "It is not exile," Henry said firmly. "It is an opportunity for a fresh start. Philadelphia is a large city where you could meet suitable young men who know nothing of recent events here. Elizabeth has connections in society there, and with your education and refinement, you could make a good marriage." Margaret felt a familiar surge of frustration. "Everything always comes back to marriage with you, does it not? As if a woman has no value except as someone's wife." In this world, Margaret, a woman's security and social position do depend largely on marriage. You have learned that lesson rather harshly over these past weeks. I am simply trying to provide you with another chance at happiness and stability. That evening, Margaret walked alone through the quiet streets of Millbrook, something she had not done since the wedding day. The town looked different to her now, less welcoming and familiar than it had before. She found herself taking the path that led past the railroad workers' boarding house, though she told herself it was merely coincidence. Through one of the lit windows, she caught a glimpse of Thomas sitting at a small table, writing in what appeared to be a journal. He looked thinner than she remembered, and there was a loneliness in his posture that made her heart ache. For a moment, she considered approaching the house, but the memory of his formal goodbye at the church stopped her. Thomas had indeed been writing, but not in a personal journal. Since the failed wedding, he had been corresponding with railroad supervisors in other states, inquiring about transfer opportunities. The sympathetic looks and awkward silences from his co-workers had become unbearable, and he felt the need for a complete change of environment. His work performance had actually improved in recent weeks, as he threw himself into physical labor with almost desperate intensity. The other men had stopped asking questions or offering consolation, recognizing that he preferred to process his pain in solitude. Patrick O'Sullivan remained a loyal friend, but even he had learned to give Thomas space when it was needed. The letter Thomas was writing that evening was to a supervisor in Colorado, where the railroad was expanding through mountain passes. The work would be dangerous and demanding, but it would also be hundreds of miles away from Millbrook and all its painful associations. He had already received a positive response to his initial inquiry, and now he was formally requesting the transfer. Meanwhile, Margaret had made her own decision about her father's suggestion regarding Philadelphia. After another sleepless night weighing her options, she realized that running away to another city would not resolve the fundamental questions she faced about what she truly wanted from life. The next morning, Margaret surprised her father by announcing that she intended to remain in Millbrook and face the consequences of her actions, rather than seeking escape in Philadelphia. "I made a choice that hurt someone I cared about and damaged our family's reputation. Running away to Philadelphia would not change that or help me learn from my mistakes. Henry was frustrated by his daughter's stubbornness, but he also recognized a new maturity in her reasoning. Very well, but you cannot continue to live as a hermit. If you insist on staying, you must find a way to reintegrate into community life. Margaret nodded, though she had no clear idea how to accomplish that goal. She only knew that hiding from her problems had not brought her peace or clarity about her feelings. At the railroad camp, Thomas was making his final preparations for departure. His transfer request had been approved, and he would leave Millbrook in 10 days. He had told no one except Patrick about his plans, not wanting to endure more expressions of sympathy or advice about starting fresh. As he packed his few belongings, Thomas found himself thinking, not with bitterness, but with a kind of sad resignation about Margaret and their brief relationship. He had loved her genuinely, and he believed that she had cared for him as well, at least initially. But perhaps they had both been naive to think that love could easily bridge the gap between their different worlds. The gold wedding ring he had intended for Margaret remained in his possession. He had considered selling it, but something prevented him from taking that final step toward closure. Instead, he wrapped it carefully in cloth and placed it in the bottom of his traveling bag, a reminder of dreams that had not come to pass. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 2 months after the failed wedding, Margaret stood at the window of her father's store watching the morning train prepare to depart. She had learned from Patrick O'Sullivan that Thomas would be leaving Millbrook that day, transferring to a railroad construction project in Colorado. Despite everything that had happened between them, the knowledge of his departure filled her with an unexpected sense of loss and finality. Margaret had spent the past weeks working to rebuild her place in the community. Though progress had been slow and difficult, she had volunteered to help organize supplies for families affected by an early winter storm, and had quietly assisted Sarah Chen's family when anti-Chinese sentiment in town had led to vandalism of their laundry business. These small acts of service had begun to soften some opinions about her character, though she remained largely excluded from the social circles she had once enjoyed. The experience had forced Margaret to examine her own values and priorities in ways she had never done before. She realized that much of her previous social life had been superficial, based more on her father's wealth and status than on genuine relationships or shared interests. The isolation, while painful, had also given her clarity about what truly mattered to her. Henry had eventually stopped pressuring her about Philadelphia, recognizing that his daughter had developed a new independence and determination that he both admired and found challenging. Their relationship remained complicated, but they had begun to work together more effectively in the business, with Margaret taking on increasing responsibilities for the store's operations. As Margaret watched the train station from her vantage point, she saw Thomas's familiar figure walking toward the platform with his traveling bag. Even from a distance, she could see the change in him. He carried himself differently now, with a kind of resigned dignity that spoke of hard-won acceptance of disappointment. She felt a powerful urge to run to the station, to speak with him one last time, but she knew that such an action would only cause more pain for both of them. Thomas boarded the westbound train without looking back toward the town. He had said his goodbyes to Patrick and a few other close friends the night before, and he felt ready to begin a new chapter of his life, far from the memories that haunted Millbrook. The railroad car was filled with other men heading west for work, most of them seeking fresh starts of their own for various reasons. As the train pulled away from the station, Thomas allowed himself one final look at the town where he had experienced both great hope and profound disappointment. He thought about Margaret, wondering if she had found the happiness and security she had been seeking. Despite the pain she had caused him, he found that he could not bring himself to wish her ill. She had been honest about her limitations, even if that honesty had come at a terrible cost to both of them. Margaret remained at the store window long after the train had disappeared from view, feeling as though a chapter of her own life was also ending. She thought about the woman she had been 2 months ago, so certain of her place in the world, and her right to make choices based on her own comfort and convenience. That woman seemed like a stranger to her now. The sound of the store bell interrupted her reverie as Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house keeper, entered. The older woman had been one of the few people in town who had consistently treated Margaret with kindness since the wedding incident, perhaps because she had witnessed Thomas's genuine heartbreak firsthand. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Patterson said warmly. I was hoping you might have some of that new fabric that came in last week. I am making winter clothes for the Miller children, since their father was injured in the mill accident. Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she had worn in weeks. Of course, Mrs. Patterson. Let me show you what we have available. As she helped the older woman select materials, Margaret realized that she was finding satisfaction in these simple acts of helping her neighbors, something she had rarely considered before her public humiliation had forced her to reevaluate her priorities. Over the following months, Margaret gradually established a new identity for herself in Millbrook. She became known not as the merchant's proud daughter who had refused a suitor at the altar, but as a reliable and compassionate member of the community who could be counted on to help in times of need. She organized fundraising efforts for families in crisis, taught reading to immigrant children at the church, and used her business skills to help other women manage their household finances. Henry watched his daughter's transformation with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. The social butterfly, who had once been primarily concerned with fashion and gossip, had become a practical, purposeful woman who seemed to find fulfillment in service to others. While he still hoped she would eventually marry well, he had stopped pushing the issue, recognizing that Margaret needed to find her own path forward. One evening in late spring, nearly a year after the failed wedding, Margaret sat in her room reading a letter from Thomas that had been forwarded through Patrick O'Sullivan. The letter was brief and formal, but it brought news that Thomas was doing well in Colorado, had been promoted to supervisor of his work crew, and had purchased a small house near the railroad camp. He wrote that he was grateful for the experience they had shared, as it had taught him important lessons about himself and what he wanted from life. The letter concluded with news that he had met a widow with 2 young children who worked as a cook for the railroad crew. They were planning to marry in the fall, and Thomas wrote that he had found the kind of partnership and mutual respect that he had always hoped to discover. He wished Margaret well and hoped that she too had found happiness and peace. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it in her dresser drawer. She felt a complex mixture of emotions reading about Thomas's new life. Sadness for what might have been, but also genuine happiness that he had found love again. She realized that her decision at the altar, painful as it had been for both of them, had ultimately allowed them both to discover who they truly were and what they really needed. As she prepared for bed that night, Margaret reflected on the woman she had become over the past year. She was no longer the sheltered, privileged daughter who had been terrified of giving up her comfortable life. Instead, she had become someone who found purpose in helping others and who had learned to value authenticity over social acceptance. She had also learned that love, while important, was not enough without mutual understanding, shared values, and compatible life goals. Margaret knew that she would probably never marry, and she had made peace with that possibility. She had found fulfillment in her work, her friendships, and her service to the community. If love came again, it would have to be with someone who could accept her as she was now, not as the person she had once been expected to become. The lonely railroad worker had found his new beginning in the mountains of Colorado, and the merchant's daughter had discovered her own path forward in the town she had never left. Both had learned that sometimes the most painful experiences can lead to the most valuable growth, and that true happiness often comes from unexpected directions.